Well, shalom, Chaverim. Welcome to the Jewish Road podcast, where we help Christians make sense of their roots so they can help the Jewish people make sense of Jesus. My name's Matt, and I'm here with my dad, Ron. Say hello.
Hi, shalom to everybody. Great to be with you.
There you go. Now, we're here to give a unique perspective on the story of God and his people. We believe this is one story that's been told in two acts, and we call that Act 1 and Act 2.
Like a two-act play.
In fact, it is. And that Act 1 is the Old Testament. The Act 2 is the New Testament. And what we've seen is that the Jewish people, they're familiar with Act 1, and they say, Act 2? Not for me.
Not for us.
That's right. And we say it's like going to a play and leaving an intermission. And then our Christian friends, they show up late. They heard about the first act, but they watch the second act. And what we are trying to do here with the Jewish Road podcast is share the whole story.
That's right.
So we are going to get into it, and we spent all of season 1 going through the fall feasts, and we are about to engage in the spring feasts. And then after that, who knows what we'll talk about, but we have a full season 2, lots of stuff going on here. And one of the things that we like the most when we do the podcast is we like to have just a little bit of fun. We'll get to the part that's not so fun, but even that we think is fun.
Yeah.
But we like to inject just a little bit.
A little bit of Jewish humor.
That's right. Now, we say inject. I think you say inflict, right? Inflict just a little bit?
Inflict, yeah.
Yeah. So we are going today to talk about the book of Esther. This is the in Jewish world is called the fast of Esther, or Purim. So we'll talk through that in a second. But do you have any good Purim humor?
Purim humor?
Yeah.
Well, I've got a Jewish story. It's the White House Jewish story.
All right, let's hear it.
You want to hear it?
We've had this whole break in here, so I'm hoping that we're starting with some of our good stuff here.
Okay. Well, let me tell you, we have here the first Jewish president of the United States.
Oh.
Has been inaugurated.
All right, so we're making believe, because
yeah,
the chances of that happening are.
And the first Jewish holiday that follows his inauguration is, guess what it is? Purim.
Purim. All right. Perfect.
So he calls up his mother to invite her to the White House because he wants his mother to be with him at the White House for Purim.
Of course.
And their conversation goes something like this.
All right.
Okay, the president says, "Ma, with Purim being the first holiday after my inauguration, I want to celebrate it with us at the White House." And his mom says, "Oh, I don't know. I'll have to get to the airport." And, the president says, "Ma, I'm the president of the United States. I'll send for a limo. It'll take you right to the airport."
Yeah.
The mom says, okay. But when I get to the airport, I'll have to stand on the line to buy a ticket and check my bag. It's going to be very difficult for me. He said, "Ma, don't worry about standing on lines or any of that. I'm the most powerful person in the world. I'm the president. I'll send Air Force One for you." She says, "Well, okay, but when I get to Washington, I'll have to find a cab."
She's not giving up. Persistent little thing.
The president says, "Ma, please, I have a helicopter waiting for you. It will bring you right to the White House lawn."
Perfect.
And it sounds like it. Mom says, "Well, in typical Jewish mother fashion, yeah, but where will I stay? Can I get a hotel room?" And the president says, "Ma, listen, we have this whole big White House. There will be plenty of room. Please join us for Purim." And so she finally says, "Okay, I'll be there." And 2 seconds later, she calls her friend and she says, "Hello, Sadie? Guess what? I'm spending Purim at my son's house." And Sadie says, "Oh, the doctor?"
Yeah.
And Mom says, "No, the other one."
The other one. The president.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Well,
All right.
pretty good. All right. Well, let's get into it. You ready?
Okay, let's do it.
The fast of Esther, the story of Esther. Let's start here. I want to talk about empires and kingdoms to start as a way to contextualize, the moment that we find ourselves in. Right now, we are in the week before actual Purim as we're recording this. And what's happening, give us just a quick picture of what's happening on the world stage right now.
What's happening on the world stage is just devastating. I think that the stage is being set for the final acts in the end of history. The actors are all taking their place on the stage. It's just a classic battle between those who want you to pay allegiance to the empire and the one who's calling you to affirm your allegiance to the kingdom.
Yeah. Now, specifically what's happening right now, there's war in Europe. Vladimir Putin has come in, and it's been a couple weeks since the attack in Ukraine. And as you go throughout history, we have seen this battle between empire and kingdom, right? You see the Pharaohs, and they're building their empire. And when you have an empire, it's demanding total commitment. And what that looks like is oppression. And it's always against this backdrop of a God who is leading his people through the wilderness. It says like a shepherd who leads his sheep. But empire always rears its ugly head. Like, take me through. Who are some of the empires and some of the leaders throughout the past?
Well, I mean, some of the empires, starting with Nebuchadnezzar. When he started off the times of the Gentiles and the empire of Babylon. You had Herod, who built an empire in Rome. You had Hitler with his Third Reich and wanted to create his whole empire. And now today you have Vladimir Putin. So there have been many empires down through world history. And it's an interesting thing. You make a point that there's a difference between empire and the kingdom.
Whenever you are looking at this difference between empire and kingdom, there's an invitation to pledge allegiance to the kingdom. It's a beckoning, right? And in the narrative of history, we are hitting what's called, in every great story, it's the climactic scene. The climactic scene is this scene that takes place, it's about 9 minutes before the end of the movie, right? This is the place where all of these open story loops are resolved and good succeeds, evil slithers away to fight another day. But it's that moment in the story, in the movie, where
we get the hero.
Yeah, we're waiting. Will the hero come through? Will they succeed, right? Will they disarm the bomb before it goes off, and will they save the city? Will the guy get to the airport just before the plane takes off so he can tell the woman he loves it's all about her, he loves her? And then you see that story, it plays out in some of these movies, right? Lord of the Rings. Will Frodo overcome the evil, and will he get that ring into Mordor? And even some of the easier...
one of my favorites, Mary Poppins. Is she going to help Mr. Banks love his family the way he really wants to?
That's right. And so you have this backdrop. And we know that Jesus, or Yeshua, he is born into this backdrop of empire, the Roman Empire. And all the while, he's talking about kingdom. You look at the Sermon on the Mount, he's talking about the kingdom. It's an invitation, and it's very backwards and very different. And so there is, and we'll throw this in the show notes, but there's this discrepancy. There is this battle that's happening between empire and kingdom. Empire, you bring the power of the sword, while the kingdom is the power of the cross, or that cursed tree. You have the empire, which seeks to control the behavior of the people, while the kingdom seeks to transform lives. What are some other things that happen between those two?
In the empire, there are tribal borders. There are people groups fighting against people groups. It's really kind of like, even as Yeshua said, the signs of the end of the age, the nation will rise against nation. The word for nation is ethnos.
Yeah.
And so you see tribal groups and people groups and ethnicity and religions and so on fighting against each other. But in God's kingdom, there's no borders. Everybody is welcome. They're accepted into the kingdom without conditions.
Right. In empire, you have an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. There's revenge. We're going to conquer with the sword. We're going to battle. Whereas what Jesus is talking about and proclaiming with the kingdom is that we return evil with good. We turn the other cheek. We walk the second mile. And so we're showing things like praying for our enemies. And when it comes to the enemies, the empire, you see these earthly enemies and these earthly battles. Much of what we're in right now in the kingdom, it's the powers of the principalities in the present darkness, and that's what we're going against. So take all of that and that concept of empire and kingdom, and that's what we have in the story of Esther. Now, most people don't celebrate this as a holiday in the church. In the Jewish world, this is kind of a big deal, and it's the time where we actually go through, we read the entire story, or the Megillah.
The Megillah, the whole book of Esther.
Right. And that's even something, you could do that in about a half hour. If you sat down, you could read through 10 chapters of the Bible. let's just hit a quick overview. I don't want to go through the whole thing, but what we want to do is just pull out a couple things that we can pay attention to and glean from, especially in a time such as this.
Yeah. Well, there are some interesting things, and if I can insert somewhere in here some historical aspects, but the Megillah of Esther, the story of Esther starts with the unlikely fate of a Jewish girl living in the Persian Empire. And you have King Ahasuerus, Xerxes II. He takes Esther, who is the cousin of the Jewish advisor Mordecai, to be his new queen after deposing Queen Vashti.
Yeah, there's a whole mess that takes place there in chapter 1. Vashti doesn't want to have anything to do with it. By the way, even just the context of the Persian kingdom, this is Cyrus coming in, right, after Babylon. So, right, the Jews are taken off, and they serve 70 years, and now we're in Persia, and the Jews, there's a good group of them that have decided we're going to stay in Persia. And now we have this Medo-Persian king, Ahasuerus or Ahashverosh in the Hebrew, and now we have this story that begins to simmer.
In the beginning of all of this, Esther hides her Jewish ancestry from Xerxes until the wicked Haman, or Haman in Hebrew, hatches his plot against the life of the Jews, and she can't hold her peace. She has to speak out for her people.
Here's what goes on, and I want you to take this into the in the framework of this idea that the empire is all about we're going to have one people group. You got to worship our way. If you don't, then you're out of here, right? So
sounds a little familiar.
Yeah, I mean here's the scene. This is in the book of Esther, chapter 3, and I'm looking at verse 8. It says, "Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, 'There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. And get this, king, their laws are different from those of every other people, and they don't keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. So if it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries.' The king takes his signet ring from his hand, gives it to Haman, the Agagite." Let's get to that in a second. "And the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, 'The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you.'" That's the kind of power you don't want to give a villain in a story.
Wow. And, it so much parallels some of the things that are taking place today in the world, even in our own country.
Yeah. I mean, and you look at every one of these different stories, right? This is the story of Hitler. There's a group of people that is not like that. Us. We're going to get rid of them. You look at even the Hanukkah story, right? And we're going to make sure that everybody is observing our Greek way of life. And if not, we're going to get rid of them.
I like those words in the verse where he says there are these people and their laws are not like ours. It's like I'm always looking at these things historically and looking at the parallels that we see today because they're so evident. We have those who look at Christians today and say, we've got to stifle them, we've got to quiet them. Their laws are not where we want to go.
That's right. There's this battle once again between empire and kingdom. It keeps coming up. And so,
of course, the Jews are in that group also.
That's right.
Always.
Yeah. So the story goes that God had placed Esther, right, into this story for a certain purpose. You have this Jewish queen now. She is right there at the top of the line with the king, and she's being advised by her uncle Mordecai. And he says a couple of things, right? One of the things he says is, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all of the other Jews." Mordecai is savvy to what's happening to Haman and what Haman is planning. So it says, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. I mean, even just stop there. Why will deliverance have to come from another place?
Because God has made a promise to his people Israel.
That's right.
He's made a promise to the Jewish people. They are not going to perish. I mean, I can't help but get excited about and look at the parallels that we're seeing today. looks like there's a building enemy base once again with Israel, and we know that there is going to be an attack. Ezekiel prophesied that, but God is not going to let it happen. Help will come from another place, and in this case, it'll come from God. And I think it came from God even in the case of Esther. It's interesting that God is not mentioned in the entire book of Esther.
Yeah, and that is one of the things. God, the name of God is not mentioned at all in this book, but you see his hand sovereignly working out through every piece of this story. Mm-hmm. So he says, if you don't do anything, then there will be deliverance. God will always have a deliverer, and it always seems that Israel's back is up against the wall, right? It's at the very last minute. Will this climactic scene, will this story end? Will God be faithful? So the deliverance will come for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, hey Esther, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?
It's amazing that the word kingdom is inserted right there. What kingdom are they talking about?
Yeah, well, I think Mordecai is speaking to a bigger and greater and better kingdom against the backdrop of the empire.
Yeah, because Israel's kingdom had really kind of dissolved with the captivity. Yeah. But they're looking forward to something else. It's kind of, if you look at it that way, it's a far prophecy.
So there's a fast. I mean, let's fast forward through a lot of this, right? She fasts for 3 days and 3 nights, and she lays out a plan. She's going to go in and talk to the king.
That's illegal.
Yeah, you got to be careful, right? He has to raise the scepter. If he doesn't, it's off with your head, even if you're the queen. Yeah. Even if you're a beautiful queen. Mm-hmm. And so she sets it up, and she has a couple of feasts. They have some wine, and she invites Haman into this. Not just one party, but there's a second party. And it's at that time that she reveals the plan of Haman. Pull us into that scene for a second. What is going on, and how is she setting up this story? You think that all hope is lost, and then she sets it up, and Haman's in there. And Haman actually had some plans for Mordecai.
Okay, well, the answer to this actually occurs in chapter 7 when the king Ahasuerus asks Esther, what would your petition be, Queen Esther? Tell me what it is that you would want, and it shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it will be done. And so Esther then goes through this little diatribe of those who are lifting their hand against the Jewish people. And ultimately, King Ahasuerus asks Esther, who is he and where is he who would presume to do this? And Esther says, a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. And, of course, then Haman becomes terrified at that.
And at this point, Haman has already built gallows for Mordecai to be hung on, right? And you go through some of the story, and Haman's walking around, and there's, he sees that Mordecai is not bowing down to him. It enrages him. He goes crazy with all that. So he says, I'm going to get rid of this guy. And it only further enrages him towards the Jewish people, the longtime enemies. In fact, we were talking earlier that Haman, his background, he is an Agagite.
Haman is an Agagite. The genesis of this whole drama gets played out between Mordecai and Haman. Also in the story, Mordecai is a Benjamite. He's a descendant of Saul, and Haman is an Agagite, which goes back almost 1,000 years, when the Jewish people exited Egypt in the Exodus. Yeah. And they were attacked by the Amalekites, who snuck up behind them, and whose lineage actually began with Amalek, who was the grandson of Esau. So you can see where, this heads back to, and God had pronounced a curse against the Amalekites, which resulted in their total elimination as a people. And Saul was supposed to go in and wipe out all of the Amalekites, the Agagites, and he did, except for Agag. And so
The enemy remains.
The enemy remained. Actually, Samuel went in and hacked Agag to pieces.
Yeah, so it says in chapter 7:7, says the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking, which is kind of an interesting way to say that, but from his wine drinking. So he's, you're either really happy or you're really, piped up and really upset. He goes into the palace and he says, those gallows that were meant for Mordecai hang Haman on the very gallows that he created there.
Wow, what a reversal.
Right. And so that would be great if that was the end of the story, but that's not the end of the story because the king and his signet ring was still on this decree that the Jewish people should be destroyed. Now, there is a whole ending to the story, and I'm going to push you towards reading the last couple chapters there, how Esther once again steps in to her role as the hero of this story, being guided by Mordecai, and really equips the Jewish people to be able to fight a battle. Now, how all of this comes about, and the celebration, and long story short, the enemy tries to kill Israel, and Israel wins. God, once again, is faithful to his people. But it says this, and this is chapter 9, verse 20. It says, and Mordecai recorded these things, and he sent letters to all of the Jews, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar, which is what we're going to be looking at on Wednesday, March 16th, 2022, coming up here. But also the 15th of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, that they should make them days of fasting. Nope, not fasting, but feasting. Feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So even today, this is how the Jewish people will remember this story of Esther. This is where we don't call it the Feast of Esther all the time. We also call it by this word,
Purim.
There you go. How do we get the word Purim?
Well, Purim is called that because Haman cast lots, or Purim.
Yeah.
And that was to determine the most propitious date for implementing his plan, which was to wipe out the Jewish people. It was a genocide.
That's right.
And the verses there that talk about the casting of lots are, very, very brief. But in Esther chapter 3 and verse 7, it says they cast pur, that is, they cast lots. And Rashi makes a comment on this.
Who's Rashi?
He was a medieval rabbi.
Okay.
And he said, whoever cast it, cast it. And the verse does not specify who. This is an elliptical verse. So he interprets the phrase, that is the lot, this way. He says, Scripture explains, and what is the poor? That is the lot. He cast lots to determine which month he would succeed. That is talking about Haman. Because of Esther's faithfulness in relying on God's guidance and her courage to speak to the king on behalf of her people, Haman's plot was foiled. And the day that he dreamed all about his success and his rise to prominence, and his success, that rise would have been accompanied by the annihilation of the Jewish people, actually became the day of the Jewish people's deliverance from death to life. And that's the day that we call Purim. Does it remind you of anything that's happening these days?
There's a difference between a tragedy and a comedy, and where the difference comes is in the ending. Now, the Purim story is a comedy in a sense because you have this story, everything looks like it's headed for disaster. There's no way out. We're up against the corner. Like I said in the very beginning, the climactic scene, will good overcome evil? And in an instant, everything is turned on its head. This combination of total reversal and perfect timing, it gives Purim its special flavor, its special joy. There will come a time, it says, that our mouths will be filled with laughter. When the Messiah comes and returns again, we will be filled with laughter.
You can imagine the relief that was there when they are facing devastation and just ultimate, annihilation, and all of a sudden the tables are turned, and the one, our enemy, who plotted all of this is the one who is destroyed.
They say that behind every Jewish joke, there's a Jewish tear. And it's a bittersweet feeling. You know, you look at all that our people have gone through, and there are certainly tears of sadness, and we remember, but there's also
tears of joy.
Yeah, God continues to deliver. It's like, is he going to actually do it again? Because it doesn't seem like we can win, over and over throughout our history.
Yeah. Well, Israel is a very strong nation, very powerful right now, but they're not going to be a match for those that are ultimately coming against them in, I believe, the not too distant future.
Yeah, and I think we're headed for another tragedy that's coming, that the Lord will come back. In our darkest hour, which is always just before the dawn, the Messiah will come back again. Now, one of the things that we looked at, and I thought this was interesting, was according to the sages, that any day that's marked by a special deliverance by God could be called a Purim. In fact, we celebrate, and we talked about this in season 1, Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, is also known throughout the Tanakh, or the first act, or the Old Testament, as Yom Kippurim. And you can actually read that as Yom Kippurim, a day like Purim. And so on the day that Yeshua, or Jesus, sacrificed himself on the cross, was the greatest Purim, or deliverance, of all. Because of that day, we were eternally delivered from our enemies.
Right, and from our sin that indwells us. So if you look at the day Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, Kippurim, Purim is embodied in that word.
The question for us is, what do we do? How do we live? How do we take this story of Purim, of Esther, and we apply that to our lives, our situation today? And it's probably never been as real as it is right now, as we see what one nation can do against another nation, that the empire comes in and wants that control, that we will be faced with a question in our own lives of, will we step in? Will we trust God to be sovereign, and that our lives are really made for such a time as this? What do you take away from all of this as you look at this and reflect on the world that we have and this story that continues to repeat over history?
What I look at really is the fact that we have to take a stand for God in our lives. It's not a matter of just filling out a card or saying a prayer or accepting Jesus, Yeshua, as the Messiah. We have to walk with him in the same way that he calls us to, and stand for the things that he stands for. He stood against great adversity in his life, in his humanity, and he said that we would, if we followed him, we would have tribulation as well. And so we need to be willing to stand for God in those things, knowing that ultimately the tables are going to be reversed and God is going to have the victory.
It takes great courage to step in and to go against what the powers of the world are suggesting. You see that in the example of Mordecai. You see that in the example of Esther. And it's a scary thing. It's not an easy just do it. Lives are at risk when you do that. So we take that into this season that we're in, the situation that this world is in. And remember that you are called out of the empire and into the kingdom, that we are supposed to look different. We're supposed to behave different. We are part of something else. And we have these heroes of the faith to remind us of the story that we are living in.
Even though God is not mentioned once again in this book of Esther, we see his hand and his deliverance throughout the whole thing. So even if you don't see the hand of God in the circumstances of your life today, you know that you can trust the heart of God.
Well, let's leave it there. That is the first episode of the second season of the Jewish Road podcast. You can find out more about what we are up to, and believe it or not, we're up to quite a bit. Go to thejewishrode.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at thejewishrode. But visit the website and check out what we're up to. And what we're really up to for the next couple of months is all things Passover. We're going to be all over the country. We're going to be doing Passover seders and teachings. Still a couple spots if you want to jump in. You can contact us through the website, but you can go to thejewishrode.com/Passover. We have some videos and other things that are coming out with all of that. You look like you want to say something.
Well, I was just going to say, you're not kidding. We are actually going to be all over this country holding Passover seders and teaching on Passover.
That's right.
God's deliverance.
Yeah, it's a great story. And it's another story of empire against kingdom. And so deliverance, and this really is the season of our deliverance. We're going to be remembering the Feast of Freedom. So, any other questions, feel free to reach out to us at shalom@thejewishrode. But thank you for listening. Thanks for hanging in there with us. There is certainly more to come. And until then, Sha'alu Shalom Yerushalayim.
Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They will prosper that love thee.
Shalom.
Shalom.